Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, which is organised by the Centre for Autism and Theology. My name is Catherine, and I'm Associate Dean Partnerships in Cardiff School of Technologies in Cardiff Metropolitan University, and I'm also a friend of the Centre hosting this webinar today. So I will introduce the panelists in a moment, but I also have a few words of introduction for those of us who've perhaps not joined us before. So the Centre for Autism and Theology was launched in 2018 and is co-directed by Professor Grant McCaskill and Dr. Leon van Oomen. We host interdisciplinary research into autism and other types of neurodivergence as they relate to theology, church, and faith. So the Centre acts as a hub that brings together all those who are interested in how neurodiversity and theology intersect. The aim is to contribute to the academic discourse, but also to be of service to the church and other faith communities. If you would like to find out more about the Centre, do take a look at the Centre for Autism and Theology website, where you can sign up to our mailing list and also find more details about how to get involved with what the Centre is doing. You can also follow us on social media. But today, it is my pleasure to introduce our three panellists who will be speaking on mental health and neurodiversity. First, Dr. Henna Cundill. She is a researcher at the University of Aberdeen, and her PhD research explored autism, anxiety, and prayer, and she currently researches ADHD and faith. Paula Duncan is a PhD candidate at the University of Aberdeen, researching OCD. She is also a supporter of the charity OCD-UK. Zoe Strong is a PhD candidate at the University of Aberdeen, researching dyslexia and engaging with the Bible. She's also a host on the Autism and Theology Podcast, where you can also find links to that on social media too. We will share 10-minute presentations from each of our panelists, during which time you can ask questions in the chat box. Our panelists will either respond in the chat or your question will be kept for the Q&A that will come after the presentations and discussions. After the presentations, we will have a short 5-minute break, and during the break and after, you can type more questions into the chat box if you think of them. And we will also have time for Q&A, ending our webinar by 6 o'clock this evening. And with that, I'm going to hand over our panelists for their presentations.
Hi, I'm Dr. Henna Cundill, and I'm one of the researchers with the Centre for Autism and Theology. And in this short presentation, I'm going to be talking a little bit about autism and anxiety. Being autistic can impact mental health in a number of ways, and not all of them negative. However, there is a much higher prevalence of anxiety as a diagnosed disorder amongst autistic people. And that's anxiety that negatively impacts a quality of life. For that reason, it's been identified as a research priority by the autistic community. Now, I should at this point say that I am not autistic myself, but my doctoral research was very much focused on the topic of autistic anxiety. So everything I share with you today comes from that research, from what my research participants said, and from the wider body of literature that is available on the topic of autism and anxiety. So although I can't speak from a first-person perspective about what autistic anxiety feels like, I can share what I've learned from listening to and reading about a number of different autistic perspectives and experiences. So anxiety is a normal part of everyday life for everyone. And to feel anxious is simply to feel the body priming itself, getting ready for a fight or flight or freeze or fawn response when something threatening or dangerous is about to happen. However, anxiety can then become problematic if the body repeatedly starts that preparation process too quickly or too often, or when there is actually no imminent threat. This is anxiety as a clinical disorder, and there are multiple types of anxiety disorder that are listed in the kinds of manuals that clinicians use to diagnose people who have disordered anxiety. These include generalized anxiety disorder, specific phobia, and social anxiety disorder, which are the three most common for autistic people. Multiple research studies have shown that anxiety disorders have a higher prevalence rate amongst autistic people, but the precise statistics on that vary. And one of the reasons for that variation and for the confusion about how much medical model anxiety affects autistic people is that diagnosis is often dependent on self-reporting of symptoms using various measuring scales and tools. But of course, as is often the case with these kinds of things, these scales and the tools that are used are based on non-autistic norms. So, for example, the most commonly used scale is the STAI, the State Trait Anxiety Inventory, which simply asks respondents to rate on a scale of 1 to 4 sentences such as, I feel calm, I feel secure, I feel upset, and so on. But this does not allow for the reality of anxiety as something which can change very quickly, depending on the environment and the state of one's body, in terms of sensory stimuli and so on, the way one might feel about filling out a form if filling out a scale like this is a stressful thing in and of itself. And it also doesn't allow for alexithymia, which is the ability to identify or name one's emotions. This affects many types of people, but is particularly common for autistic people. Now, because of this difference, some researchers have started to work on anxiety measurement scales that are specifically designed for autistic people. One such team of researchers is that led by Dr. Jackie Rogers at the University of Newcastle. And they have developed an anxiety measurement scale which takes much more account of how anxiety presents in autistic people, and how autistic people who have something like alexithymia might work with their own bodily experience in order to identify their emotions. So you can see from the slide here an excerpt from one of these adapted scales, and that it has a much heavier emphasis on noticing the somatic or bodily symptoms of anxiety, such as one's heart racing, listed at number 3 there, or feeling as if you can't breathe at number 6, rather than just the phrase, I feel scared, that you would get on the normal STAI. And there's also this focus on specific places and events. So not thinking quite so much about the anxiety itself as the things that might trigger that anxiety, such as situations where I could make a mistake at point 4, or changes to surroundings and daily routine at number 9. So this scale is available as a free download at the address given on the slide there. And there's also a slightly different one adapted for use with children. And if you are an autistic person who feels that they want to talk to their GP or some other kind of clinician about the possibility of being diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, accessing and completing a scale like this and taking it to your appointment may be helpful, especially if you're working with a clinician who is not specifically trained to deal with how anxiety presents in autistic people, and if they don't know how that can be different to how it presents in non-autistic people. Another point on the medical model. In the clinical literature, anxiety needs to be distinguished from fear. And the way they do this is to say that fear is the body responding to a perceived actual threat, so a reasonable fear. For example, an elephant is charging towards you and your body primes itself to run away. This is a reasonable fear. But anxiety occurs in the absence of reasonable fear. So you begin to feel primed to run away even before leaving the house, just in case an elephant charges at you. So much so that you might decide not to leave the house, even though, if you live in Scotland, it's fairly unlikely that an elephant is going to charge at you. Now, the obvious difficulty with this is that it can be very subjective in real life as to what counts as an unreasonable anxiety versus a reasonable fear. Forgetting about elephants for now, where I live, at the back of the garden, there is a public footpath, and there's no fence between my garden and the public footpath. Well, this means that when people are walking their dogs, often the dogs will come running into our garden if they're off the lead. Now, an autistic friend of mine said, "Oh, I couldn't bear it if that were my garden. I would never be able to leave the house because I'm absolutely terrified of dogs in case they run up and bite me." Now, it's incredibly subjective as to whether this is an unreasonable anxiety or a reasonable fear, because logically, it is entirely possible that someone's dog could run into the garden and run up to me and attack me and bite me when I'm out there. And yet, this is something that I almost never think about. But I can entirely see it from my friend's perspective. There's something about the way her autistic mind can be highly cognizant of multiple different things at once, which means that, well, when I go out to my bird feeders, I'm only thinking about filling up the bird feeders. But if she were to go out to fill up my bird feeders for me, she would be very aware of multiple other things, as well as and including the possibility of a dog running into the garden. So therefore, I can understand why to her this is a reasonable fear and not an unreasonable anxiety. And from this, I want to suggest that just as we become quite accustomed these days to being able to separate the medical model and the social model of autism, so I want to propose that we should be talking about separate medical models and social models of autistic anxiety. And although he doesn't use this term social model of anxiety quite so explicitly, what I'm doing here is drawing on the work of Dr. Luke Bearden. In his book, Avoiding Anxiety in Autistic Adults, he talks about an equation of autism plus environment equals outcome. And that outcome is very often autistic anxiety. He makes the point that the predominant neurotype world that we live in is predisposed to make autistic people anxious. This is initially because the physical environment can cause sensory overwhelm. So things like fluorescent lighting, loud noises, the strong smells from cleaning products and so on, that create a constant barrage, making the social world an exhausting and overwhelming place to be. And at the same time, there are also social norms and systems which can create anxiety for autistic people. He writes about how autistic people are often socially othered, treated as outsiders, without non-autistic people making accommodations to autistic ways of communicating and so forth. And what he's really talking about is the double empathy problem, although he never actually calls it that. But nevertheless, Bearden talks about communication between autistic and non-autistic people, highlighting how there seems to be a clash over style, the meaning of words, and expectations in terms of things like body language. And he suggests that too often it's the autistic person who is deemed as being at fault, when in fact there is a two-way difficulty going on. And it's this feeling of being constantly misunderstood or somehow in the wrong that can lead to significant anxiety for autistic people. So if we accept the premise that I am talking about here, that there is a social model of autistic anxiety, then that moves us away from talking about autistic anxiety as being located within autistic people. And it pushes non-autistic people such as myself towards examining our social world and thinking, how can I be a part of helping my autistic friends, reducing the anxiety burden that they have to live with every day? And what this comes down to, again, is the double empathy problem, except I would rather call it the double empathy solution, which means that when I deliberately take the time to empathetically engage with an autistic person, such as my friend who is terrified of the idea of a dog running into my garden, I can start to understand that anxiety, and I can start to think about what environmental changes I might make in order to reduce the anxiety burden. For example, by keeping the back door of my house closed when she comes round, so that a dog can't run in. Not that that's ever happened, but it's theoretically possible. And if one of those dogs ever catches sight of one of my cats and decides to give chase, I'm sure that day is coming. And of course, I'm not going to assume that my friend is comfortable to go out into my garden and fill up my bird feeders. To put it another way, I wouldn't ask my non-autistic friends to pick up my pet tarantula, if I had one, which I don't, because I know that it is very common amongst people of any neurotype to be afraid of deadly predatorial spiders. So why would I ask my autistic friend to do something that I know is equally as terrifying for them? This kind of empathetic engagement does often require a little more intentionality and effort on the part of non-autistic people, as there is so much that we often take for granted about the social and sensory world. So those of us who are non-autistic do have to check our privilege. But hopefully, if you're engaging with this webinar today, you're here because you're willing and interested to do that. So thank you for listening.
I'm Zoe Strong and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Aberdeen researching dyslexia and engaging with the Bible. I'm also a dyslexic Christian. Today I'm going to be speaking on dyslexia, the Bible and concept of self. 7 to 10% of people are dyslexic and struggle with reading and information processing, often resulting in mental health issues. Studies have shown that dyslexia often co-occurs with anxiety, depression, and other mental health challenges. However, emotional difficulties are often overlooked due to a focus on overcoming reading challenges. Little research concerning the experience of the general adult population has been done. Michael A. McNulty's work is of significant importance, as he was one of the first within academia to identify a need for hearing the life stories of dyslexic adults who had been diagnosed during childhood. McNulty found that the spontaneous reflections of his dyslexic participants uncovered insights into the lifelong impact of dyslexia on a person's emotional well-being. A number of the reflections included in this work are recollections of childhood experiences which left participants with trauma, such as being asked to read aloud in school. McNulty's work is evidence of the need to listen to dyslexic lived experiences. While there are a few studies exploring dyslexic adult experiences and demonstrating the mental health challenges that dyslexic adults are facing, it's still an area that's substantially under-researched. Given that dyslexic people are at a higher risk of experiencing mental health challenges, this led me to wonder what it could be said about this in the context of church and the Christian faith. In many Christian communities, there's a strong emphasis on Bible reading, particularly individual Bible reading. One example of this is the well-known children's song, "Read Your Bible, Pray Every Day," where the lyrics teach that if you fail to do this, you will shrink, shrink, shrink. For dyslexic Christians, this can pose significant challenges and create some problematic expectations of what it means to be a Christian. It's not unknown that dyslexic people can struggle to read, so often what happens is a dyslexic person will say they're struggling with reading the Bible, and people try to respond with solutions. For example, people will say, "Have you tried an audio Bible?" Or "Have you tried a dyslexia-friendly Bible?" Or "Here's a suggestion for how you can help develop the regular Bible reading habits." So often these solutions just don't work for dyslexic people. For example, it's estimated that 70% of dyslexic people also have audio processing disorders, so an audio Bible will not work for a lot of dyslexic people. Sometimes, even if these suggestions do work for individual dyslexics, the Bible can be such an overwhelming thing that even trying to start engaging with it feels terrifying. Given that so many dyslexic people are struggling with mental health issues, rather than offering solutions, I think more work needs to be done that actively listens to dyslexic experiences. So my project explores dyslexia and engaging with the Bible to hear those stories of dyslexic Christians. In my project, I work with a group of 4 other dyslexic Christians who make key decisions about the project with me and also share their experiences with me, which inform the research. I also interviewed 15 dyslexic participants, some of which did reflective journals. One key thing that has come up in my research is concept of self. In every interview and most journals, participants shared stories of mental health challenges throughout their lives, or described feelings that indicated some level of low mental health. These experiences were closely linked with self-perception. Experiences that impacted their concept of self were often related to other life factors, but dyslexia was always found within the story, whether it was a catalyst for bullying, prevented them from expressing their emotions, or led them to compare themselves to others. So often participants shared their worries over how people perceived them and how this impacted how they viewed themselves. One participant, Jamie, shared the following. I feel like, I don't know how they actually perceive me, but in my head, I always think that people will perceive me as stupid. And I feel like it's a big thing that I'm trying to prove I'm not. And then I feel like if you do bring up dyslexia, quite often people think of it as an excuse. I don't actually know if that's how people feel, but that's just what I think people feel. I think it's sometimes that I believe that by myself. So then when I think other people are thinking that, I feel like it just reinforces negative things. And I guess that's probably from growing up with dyslexia. I think it's just something that I've always kind of struggled with. Jamie's experience was echoed in other participants' experiences. When I shared this quote with the small group of dyslexic Christians who work with me on the project, one person said, "Trying to prove that I'm not stupid, that has been my life's work." Feeling stupid and not good enough is evidently a common experience for dyslexic people. But how does this translate in a church context? A number of participants mentioned reading out loud, particularly in small groups. One participant even described it as torture. When I asked one participant, Agnes, how it felt when she had to read aloud in a group Bible study, she shared the following. This is quite a long quote, but I think it's important to share it all. Agnes said, "I think it's total panic. And then you're starting to get hot, and then you're trying really hard to think, and then the brain, it's not engaged, it's switched off. It's not overload, it's just not there. You're trying hard to think about something, you're on the spot and you're going to be expected to answer something about a question. And you haven't read the passage and you haven't really listened to what other people are saying. The anxiety sort of builds up, as I say. You feel very hot, and then I do feel like it's like a disengagement. I just disengage. There are times where I've been in completely the wrong part of the Bible as well, because I've got all my Johns muddled up and all of my numbers muddled up. And being in a group with people you don't know very well, that's hard. So I suppose there's a bit of self-doubt as well. Am I in the right place? Am I reading the right passage? And then am I being able to take it in quick enough to be able to answer a question that someone's going to ask? Maybe because I've been in the wrong passage, in the wrong place, I feel, I better say something really profound so that I don't look stupid. And then you're trying to think of something really clever, which obviously it doesn't work often. So then, you're battling with this shut down brain. The level of concern Agnes has surrounding something that may appear simple highlights the hidden challenges of dyslexia in relation to mental health and self-esteem. How Agnes appears in this situation is silent, but for her mind is not silent. All of this makes her worry about how others perceive her. This worry leads her to experience symptoms of anxiety. Agnes and Jamie's experiences seem to be part of a wider narrative of dyslexic people feeling and trying to prove that they're not stupid. Furthermore, the way Agnes describes the Bible, how it's composed and presented in a way that isn't easy to engage with as a dyslexic person, and that in itself causes her self-doubt before she even begins to engage with the passage, just shows how tricky it can be for dyslexic people. This cycle of low self-esteem where dyslexic people feel stupid, so try to prove that they're capable, and then in turn feel worse about themselves, significantly impacts an individual's self-perception. These are just two of many other examples that speak into a wider issue of low self-esteem among dyslexic Christians. I think this is key to why interventions such as dyslexia-friendly Bibles and audio Bibles and other attempts to make the Bible more accessible often don't work, because they're failing to address the entirety of the dyslexic challenge. I often get asked to suggest solutions for helping dyslexic people to read the Bible, But my main concern here is that in offering solutions, we then gloss over the mental health needs that desperately need to be addressed. This isn't to say that we shouldn't be looking at resourcing and supporting dyslexic people. Over summer, I worked with Bible Society, and I was very encouraged by the work they're doing in creating dyslexia-friendly scripture products. However, by just focusing on resourcing, the support for dyslexic Christians becomes a little bit superficial. What might it look like if instead of jumping to and imposing solutions, we sit with dyslexic people, hear their stories and learn from them? This is a concept that another PhD researcher at Aberdeen University, Cody Crawshaw, and I have coined as dwelling in the problem. As a researcher who is also dyslexic, hearing stories that resonate with my experience has started to break down some of my own barriers to engaging with the Bible. From hearing the stories of others who are like me, I don't feel so alone, and I don't feel so incapable. I don't feel that I need to prove myself and my capabilities so much, and I'm more confident in my own unique ways of thinking and being, and the Bible feels less intimidating. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to scan this QR code, you can find more of my work and follow me on social media. And I really look forward to hearing your questions.
I'm delighted to be here to talk about neurodivergence and mental health. My research focuses on OCD and its relationship with your faith and how it affects your relationship with God. So I would like to talk a little bit today about my experience of having both OCD and dyspraxia and the way that's shaped my perception of mindfulness in particular. So I live with both obsessive compulsive disorder and dyspraxia. OCD is a mental health disorder characterized by upsetting and unwanted intrusive thoughts and compulsive and often repetitive behaviors, including mental rituals, which is something I particularly struggle with. Dyspraxia, using the NHS definition, is a common disorder that affects movement and coordination. For me, this includes spatial reasoning difficulties, verbal dyspraxia, which can create hesitance in speech, which you might notice, and difficulties with short-term memory and information processing. So I was diagnosed with OCD in 2018, aged roughly 24. I was only diagnosed with dyspraxia in the first year of my PhD, so around about 2021, I think. And I can definitely see how my neurodiversity fed into my OCD. And it was a difficult journey to kind of reach that point and recognise that. And knowing what I know now, I can start to recognise the experiences I was having as young as 4 or 5 years old fed into the onset of OCD at around 8 or 9 years old. A lot of my compulsive behaviour came from a need to avoid getting into trouble or doing anything wrong. And this wasn't particularly a worry I had at home, but it was one that I developed in early years education, where I realised that my interpretation of an instruction wasn't always what my teachers wanted from me. I became a serial confessor from there. Anything I had done wrong or thought I had done wrong would become debilitating, and I'd have to tell my parents about my imagined crimes, often in the middle of the night. A notable event for me would be thinking that I'd taken an extra sweet from our youth group leader when we were leaving, when I thought we were only supposed to take one. And this was all because a friend had said to me, "Oh, were we supposed to take two?" And it turned out that she had misheard, not that I had misunderstood the instruction, but she had. But I assumed that I was at fault. I was guilty, selfish, greedy, hadn't listened. And I spent all night crying about this until my mum phoned our youth group leader and told me it was okay. Incidentally, in adulthood, I began to realise that maybe that phone call may have been staged. Either way, I think it was the right thing to have done at the time. There was no other way I was going to be able to go back to bed and deal with my the extent of my crimes. Because I can't imagine my youth group leaders being super happy to have received that phone call about a lollipop in the middle of the night. But in hindsight, knowing that dyspraxia affects the way that I process and execute tasks, this worry starts to make a little bit more sense to me. I knew that I often misunderstood what was expected, or that I had interpreted an instruction slightly differently, and I hated how I felt when I was corrected. And I just endeavoured to never let that happen again. In the treatment of OCD, this would be called the formation of a core belief, something that becomes internalized and shapes your worldview. in adulthood, for me, this developed into a fear of getting something wrong in class or any sort of written correspondence. I used to check my emails so often before I sent them that it took me about 2 hours to send a 2-sentence email in the library. And I was in tears because I just wanted to look up the word "and" in the dictionary, because my OCD, that sort of nagging voice at the back of my head, was telling me that it didn't mean what I thought it meant. And obviously, by sending that, I was sending something super inappropriate or just incorrect, and then I would be discovered as being some sort of fraud that didn't really know what words meant, or that I'd written something inappropriate and forgotten. As a sort of seasonal example, I used to really struggle with sending Christmas cards because once I've sealed them in the envelope, you can't easily go back and check what you've written. And I was always certain that I had either spelt somebody's name wrong, put the wrong card in the wrong envelope, and just written something inappropriate or incredibly rude. And I never had, but I would find myself having to take pictures of the inside of Christmas cards to make sure they said what I thought they said. So I had endless sort of camera roll video, like photos of "Dear Zoe, Merry Christmas from Paula," and like endless sort of identical Christmas cards. But I felt like I had to take those pictures just to reassure myself later on that I hadn't done something wrong, because the worry would inevitably appear. So I'm comfortable sharing that I'm still receiving treatment for OCD, and I'm still waiting for specialist treatment for some aspects of it that I find difficult. But I have in general been successful using cognitive behavioural therapy and exposure and response prevention to help me address fears around contamination and checking behaviours, this sort of reassurance seeking patterns. Being able to sort of recognise and interrupt those helps me stop sort of perpetuating the cycle of OCD. But what I wanted to focus on for the rest of my the short presentation today is sort of tying in with what the others have said, and it's my experience of mindfulness as somebody with a neurodivergence. Because I guarantee that anyone who's sort of sought treatment for a mental health condition has been asked at some point, have you considered yoga, mindfulness, or deep breathing? And it can be so difficult navigating that conversation when you feel like it doesn't actually help you. In honesty, I used to find it absolutely intolerable to sort of try and practice mindfulness in any meaningful way. I distinctly remember being at school and we were asked to do this sort of deep breathing exercise to make us feel calmer in the run up to our exams. But I became convinced that I would no longer be able to breathe independently. I couldn't relegate that back to the sort of realms of my subconscious, and I was inevitably going to have to think about breathing for the rest of my life, eventually forget, and subsequently die. Which, in hindsight, I can see is a bit of a leap. But I found it so difficult to sit still with a brain that doesn't ever stop talking and comes up with things like, you're going to forget how to breathe and then you'll die. And present these sort of thoughts to me as perfectly rational and things that I should act and respond to, which sort of characterizes OCD in its entirety, I think. Every thought that you have feels important. It feels as important as, what am I going to have for dinner? The sort of thought that I might forget how to breathe, suffocate and die has the same weighting in my mind, which can be really, really challenging. And it wasn't until I came across this book by John Hirschfield and Tom Corboy that I started to be able to make sense of what mindfulness might be for people with a neurodivergence or mental health condition. It was the first time I'd seen it sort of written down in a way that actually felt reassuring and felt like something I could achieve. There's a wonderful example in the book where they are describing a train platform, and with somebody with OCD, they're on the train platform, but when the trains pass, they want to get on and check that everybody has got the right ticket, that everybody's going to the right place, everybody has a seat, everybody's absolutely in the right place, doing the right thing. But what I actually should be doing is learning how to stay on the train platform and not respond when the trains pass. It's not my responsibility to check all the tickets, check everyone's doing the right thing. So learning how to tolerate the thoughts that are all presented to me as important and valid and sort of valuable, learning how to sit with that and not respond. And the book really, for me, it explained mindfulness as something that's not necessarily going to be comfortable. It's not even going to be something I enjoy. It's just a skill that I can learn that will eventually help me and that I can get better at as time goes on. And I really think this book sort of demonstrates that really well. So just by way of conclusion, I'd just like to reflect on the fact that it's books like that one, the mindfulness book, and this one, FAQs about OCD by Zoe Wilson and Ashley Fullwood, that makes such a difference to people living with something like OCD. Being able to recognize yourself in the pages of those books and feel less alone, feel less like there's something wrong with you, makes the world of difference. And for me, OCD UK have been the biggest game changer in my treatment, I think. I started going to the support groups in early 2020, just when they became virtual groups owing to lockdown. But what a difference that's made to my life, just being able to talk more openly and honestly about OCD. And it's given me the confidence to do webinars like this and talk about my experiences in the hopes that it'll help somebody else sort of identify or recognize what they're going through. So if you want to find out more about OCD, I'd really recommend this book and their website as well. So yeah, just a wee thank you to OCD UK for helping me to get to the point where I could do this webinar.
Welcome back, everybody. So for the next part of this session today, we're going to be going through the Q&A. So I'm going to be reading out the questions and then our panelists will be responding. So thank you for the questions that you have popped into the chat. That's really helpful for us, and for all the upvoting that you did as well. So I'm going to go through these, perhaps a little bit randomly, but where we've got some prioritization through the upvoting, I'll be sure to keep that in mind. But we've got quite a lot of questions to get through. So starting with, and I will just throw this open to the panelists and anyone can free to jump in. How do we help the church community and congregation to understand mental health and autism better, especially with the double empathy problem? And I'm guessing probably, Henna, you might want to kick off on this one.
Yeah, I can do. And I can start with, combine that with one of the other questions we've had, which was just to ask for a bit more explanation around the double empathy problem. To get a really helpful guide on it, you can just go to the National Autistic Society website, and they have a very helpful page. But in summary, the double empathy problem is about how people with very different experiences of the world, they can struggle to empathize with each other. So they can struggle to understand each other's life, world and experience, and just what the world looks and feels and sounds like, and how somebody moves through the world as a result. A common example would be eye contact. So many autistic people find eye contact quite uncomfortable. It can even feel painful. And so a non-autistic person might, look to make eye contact with someone they've just met, and that person looks away to the side or down to the floor while they're speaking. Well, to a non-autistic person like myself, the first instinct is to think, this person doesn't want to speak to me, because in the non-autistic norm, that's what that behavior communicates. But of course, that's not what's being communicated if that person is autistic and finds eye contact uncomfortable. What they're actually suggesting is they do want to speak to me, and therefore, to make that comfortable, they're going to move their eye gaze away. And so if what happens at that point is I think, oh, this person doesn't want to speak to me, and I just give up and walk away, then that exchange doesn't happen. And that's how the double empathy problem can work out in practice. It's that not knowing each other's kind of expectations and experiences of the world. And now I forgot what the original question was.
Would you like me to read it out again? Because
yes,
there is actually a little subpart to the question. So the original question was, how do we help the church community and congregation to understand mental health and autism better, especially with the double empathy problem? But somebody else has also put a sub-question, which is, could you include the pastoral aspect in particular?
Yeah, no, that's great. And that sub-question really sort of gets to the heart of how I was thinking to answer this anyway, in terms of it sort of depends who's asking. So if you're a church leader or a pastor or somebody who's leading a pastoral care team and you're asking this question, then I would suggest the first step is to ask the autistic person or people in your congregation
what this question means to them and what comes to mind for them, because there's so much diversity within autistic experience of mental health and of everything, that it's quite hard to give generalizable answers. So the empathy process starts with attentiveness and paying attention to people, and just persisting through those little things that might trip you up, like somebody having a different pattern of eye contact or a different pattern of turn taking in conversation, maybe needing to process language a bit more slowly and take pauses in between an exchange. If you can persist through that and actually take the time to be attentive to an autistic person, you could start to answer that question in a way that's very localized to your context and your church community. If it's the autistic person who's asking the question here, which it may well be, I appreciate that's a little bit harder because you're kind of needing to make the approach. One thing I can suggest is it's important to identify who the gatekeepers are in your church community. If you want to be starting conversations within the church about mental health and autism and what that's like, it's not always necessarily the pastor whose attention you need to get. And that might be a helpful thing, because it can be less intimidating to think, well, who is it in the congregation who really influences what goes on here, and who I feel safe approaching and having this conversation with, and start there. And if you look on the Centre for Autism and Theology website, there's various resources and things that can help with that. And you can also contact us via the email address. That if either of you want to add anything in to that.
I think for me, part of it is just listening to individuals as well, because everybody's got their sort of own experience. What's that phrase? If you've
met one autistic person.
Yeah, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And I think that sort of translates for mental health as well. And I think listening to the people who are actually there in your congregations and what they specifically need, because it might be completely different from what the person sitting next to them is. So yeah, I think that would be my thought.
Yeah, just echo that, and also a little bit of research about what neurodiversity, specific neurodivergences are as well. Like, a lot of people have assumptions about autism, dyslexia, OCD, especially OCD as well, with like what OCD actually means, and just a quick Google, you can get a lot of information, and that can help when you go into a conversation with someone just to understand them better. But yeah.
I was going to say, and that was a consistent theme in your presentations, speaking to people, asking what they need, what they think. That's so important, that communication piece. So thank you for that. But whilst I'm talking to you, Zoe, we've got a question here for you, which is, would you be able to talk about the social sort of / cultural background of your participants and speculate as to the effect different backgrounds might have on mental health for dyslexic people?
Yeah, so most of my participants did have access to higher education. I think that is an issue with research in general. A lot of the people we end up speaking to have maybe had access to higher education, and that probably impacts a lot of the results we get. But that being said, my participant challenges, as I said, every single participant, it came through in their interview and journals. One example, Jamie, who I quoted during the presentation, she has a professional job that required a lot of training. She is very highly educated, but she still felt stupid a lot of the time, even though she was from a more privileged isn't quite the right word, but even though she was from a background where she was unable to go into higher education, she still felt that way. But yeah, coming back to the question more broadly about background impacting mental health, there are quite a few studies coming out that show that support from parents makes a difference on dyslexic mental health. If dyslexic children feel supported by their parents, they are much more likely to thrive in school, to feel less anxious in social situations. So that is so important. And I think I see that in my own experiences as well. While sometimes I struggle with anxiety, and the mental health and dyslexia thing is very clear in my experience, my parents were very supportive. My mum noticed that I was dyslexic when I was very young and pushed very hard for me to be assessed. And that has probably made a huge difference in my personal experience, and just that support I've had of dyslexia being something to be proud of and not a problem, has definitely had a positive impact in my life. And also that earlier intervention is so important. And yeah, and just one more thing as well, it's if you're an adult wanting a dyslexia identification, that's expensive. So being from certain social economical backgrounds where you can afford that identification, you can afford to go through that process, and have that identity and know that you're dyslexic, that makes a difference as well. I wonder if, I know this was a question about dyslexia, but Paula, coming off that early intervention identification, I wonder if there's anything to be said about OCD with that.
Yeah, for sure. OCD, there's this horrifying statistic that I think is published on the International OCD Foundation website, that from onset of symptoms to your initial diagnosis of OCD, it's often roughly 17 years. There's been an improvement, and this is down to like 12.9 years or something, which I don't think is great. And a lot of it is because a lot of the compulsions can often be hidden, or they're kind of hidden in plain sight as well, like my persistent reassurance seeking or checking behaviors. It kind of just came across as sort of childhood anxiety or low self-esteem or just that kind of thing, and it wasn't picked up as being part of OCD because the information just wasn't there. There wasn't the resources that helped anyone identify that in my life, and certainly didn't give me the language to be able to tell people what was sort of happening in my head. I think it makes such a difference that it's now, I think things are definitely changing, and it's starting to become a little bit more recognizable, I think would be the word. And that's really encouraging to me, and it's partly why I'm doing the research I'm doing, because I really want to be part of that change and help somebody else recognize their own OCD earlier and get help quicker.
That's really interesting.
That's great.
Okay, I've got a question that maybe everybody on the panel could answer. And this is, given that churches aspire to be caring places, what do you think makes it difficult for them to create inclusive spaces for people who are neurodivergent or people with neurodiversity?
I think sometimes people get overwhelmed by the complexity. Or, as I said, every autistic person is going to have their own unique profile of what it means to be autistic in terms of what is or isn't going to make a church space inclusive for them. And so busy pastors like a checklist of, if I just do these 10 things, then I'm inclusive, tick. We've put in a wheelchair ramp, therefore we're disability friendly kind of thing, but that only touches one area of a disabled person's life. Even if they are a wheelchair user, it just doesn't solve the whole problem. I think sometimes then, though, that complexity becomes a barrier to doing anything at all. It's the sort of, we can't please everyone, so we won't try and please anyone type thing. And that's such a pity because, in the non-autistic neurotypical world, if you want to call it that, we all the time make little accommodations for people who are bold enough to ask for them. So it's perfectly doable. But I think sometimes there's a sort of a mental battle with this idea that complexity is just impossible and therefore it's better to do nothing. And that's unfortunate, but I think that often is the case.
I think as well, I would say a lot of it is underlying theological beliefs as well, particularly in my research looking at engaging with the Bible. It would be easy just to say, oh, well, dyslexic people shouldn't engage with the Bible. But the Bible is still a central part of Christian faith, and a lot of dyslexic Christians still do want to engage with the Bible. It's so it's kind of holding that together of, okay, the Bible is difficult, but that it is still a central part of the Christian faith. So how do you then navigate through that? Becomes really difficult to be inclusive. Certainly, in my experience, I battle against that a lot with people in sermons saying, oh, if you want to grow in your faith or whatever, spend time with God through engaging with the Bible. And I understand why they're saying that. I don't think we should be discouraging people to engage with the Bible necessarily. But then how, as a dyslexic Christian, I'm then excluded from that. And that's really difficult. doesn't answer. I think the way going forward is just, again, that listening to people, understanding what it looks like for dyslexic Christians to authentically engage with the Bible in ways that are comfortable for them. But again, in a lot of churches, there's such this ingrained idea of like, we need to read the Bible, like that song, read your Bible, pray every day, or you'll shrink. So I think a lot of it is also underlying theological beliefs makes it hard to become inclusive.
I think for me, part of it is being willing to try something new and being willing to get it wrong and learn from it, and be willing to be surprised by how something goes. Part of my OCD makes it difficult for me to go to church, but I do work with children through in a brownie leader, so it's kind of learning how to adapt things in a way that might turn out to actually help everybody, not just the one child that we're trying to make adaptations for. And kind of listening to them, being willing to learn from their experience, because they're the ones that are going to know best, aren't they? Like, yeah. I think the same applies to adults too, isn't it?
I love that, like being willing to get it wrong. Like sometimes it's just nice if someone like tries. And I know sometimes that can be unhelpful, but if like the intentions are there, if they've listened, and that's fine. If it, like dyslexia friendly Bibles, for example, if it's done with the good intentions, if it's caring for like the holistic experience, it's okay if it's maybe done slightly wrong sometimes.
Especially if they're willing to take feedback.
Yes.
And like if you try something and pitch it to people that are going to use it, and they say, maybe this isn't working as well, but this alternative might. It's still a starting place. It's somewhere to like begin that conversation and get things moving. Like
it's okay to like soundboard ideas. Yeah,
I think that's such an important piece, isn't it? Part of the learning journey is being prepared to make mistakes, and that being okay. We're all on that journey. So it kind of related to the question that you've just been answering, but I will raise it anyway. This poster has mentioned about the commonality that we've just talked about the individual listening to individuals. And this person is asking, I felt as though there was a common theme in Henna and Zoe's presentations. That individual relationships and listening to the ND experiences are key. Something which is not catered for in the upfront one-way presentation style of many Christian activities. Do the panelists feel that shifting from upfront or more emphasis on small groups, maybe one-to-ones, would be helpful?
You're smiling as if you want to jump in on it.
No, I'm smiling because I looked at this quite a bit for my master's dissertation on like kind of community, and small groups can be a horrible place for dyslexic people, but they can also be such a helpful place if they're safe spaces. Oh, we've written a paper on that. And just that. I think when we're in groups of people and there's understanding, there's community, there's friendship there, it comes back that if someone gets something wrong and you're in a community setting where everyone cares, there's back and forth, it feels much less harmful and exclusive than it does if there's maybe like someone saying something up front that's then, so going back to that example of someone saying, just read your Bible, but if that's done in a community setting, a small group setting, there's then a little bit of back and forward that can happen of understanding each other. And I think that is just a general issue with a lot of Christian communities, particularly Protestant evangelical Christian communities, is that move away from community towards individualism and not kind of participating in communities. But that was a slightly rambly answer, but
I think it was a good answer, though.
I think, thanks, Paula.
Because I think there's a balance to be found, because some people might really dislike the small group sort of settings. I think when I go to church, when I do manage to do that, usually around about this time of year, I quite like to just blend in. And so, I guess it's different for everybody, isn't it?
I think in some ways we might be trying too hard to speak about church as if we know what constitutes church. Some people are thinking about the gathering, some people are thinking about the whole interconnected network not just of those that gather on a Sunday and those that gather in the small groups, but then all those people who are what sometimes gets called on the fringes of those communities that are connected in different ways. And at what point are we talking about church, and is the church inclusive? So one of the things I ended up exploring in my doctoral thesis was the idea of non-presence, because many of my participants couldn't attend church weekly, certainly not, or even more than sort of once a month or so, just because they didn't have the spoons, they didn't have the energy for church on top of the load that they were already carrying in terms of being neurodivergent and having mental health challenges and things. But they still very much thought of themselves as part of the church, or even sometimes a specific church. So when I say the church, I mean like, worldwide, the church proper, as it were. So we need, those of us that are sort of weekly, have to be there either because we have to be or we want to be, need to be thinking about kind of how we esteem those who might not be present but are still very much part of the church, and what non-presence means. And it's another example of that double empathy problem, that for a neurotypical person, it might be that if somebody is only coming to church once every couple of months, they might be perceived as not committed, not interested, not part of the community. But actually for that person, even just coming once every 2 months is an enormous effort and shows a huge amount of commitment to that community. But you've got to kind of understand what's being communicated through the behaviour there, which involves overcoming this sort of double empathy barrier.
That's such an interesting point about holding those who maybe can't make it on a regular basis in higher esteem than we perhaps already do. That's such an interesting point. Thank you. And related to this, I have a question here that's asked of you, Henna. Henna's story about the dog was very helpful to gain insights. So what elements of church do you feel most represent the dog for people with anxiety in church?
Yeah, okay. And again, it's going to vary from person to person. If it's somebody particularly who's struggling with social anxiety, then the obvious ones are going to be the coffee hour, or even just getting a funny, what feels like a funny look that might not be intended to be a funny look from someone. For another person, it may be quite tangible, physical things. And this is something that one of our centre directors, Leon van Ommen's, doing a lot of research into, that strong smells, if somebody's got strong perfume or body odour, if they're not wearing perfume, or things like that, difficult lighting, problems with the sound system. These things, if somebody has particular sensory sensitivities, can become the dog in that situation. I know, although I'm not autistic, I've had periods where sudden loud noises were problematic for me, and the terror, you get that little whistle just before the sound system makes the awful noise where something's gone wrong with the microphone, and just that little beep before the huge noise was enough to be like, I need to run, and so I can really sympathize with some individuals who might be coming to church every time, terrified for the entire service that there might be either a sudden loud noise or that awful threatening high-pitched beep going on in the background that of course a lot of people can't hear if they don't have that auditory range. So yeah, the dog can be all sorts of things, and it is worth taking the time to talk to individuals. Sometimes you can eliminate barriers, but as one of our other questions touches on, sometimes people have competing needs. And this has come up in one of the worshipping communities that I'm connected to at the moment, and I'm connected to several, which is handy because it helps to avoid giving away identities. But we've got a congregation where one person is coming with an emotional support animal, and another person in the congregation is very uncomfortable that this animal is not on the lead, or sort of restrained in any way. And it hasn't become a complete barrier to either of those people attending the church, but it was a conversation that had to happen to say, okay, how can we make these competing needs kind of possible for you? Can we do it? And if so, how? But it takes the conversation, and the sort of one size fits all probably isn't going to work. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I have got a question here that's being asked of Zoe, but I suspect everyone will perhaps have a perspective on it. What do you think can help non-neurodivergent people to stop defining and describing problems from their own point of view? what would you recommend? Listening and empathy clearly help, but the main framework of interpretation would still remain the same. For instance, that dyslexia is a learning or reading disability. How can we challenge and potentially change these perspectives?
It's a really good question. Can I be really annoying and ask you to read it again?
Yeah, of course, it's quite a long one. So essentially, what do you think can help non-neurodivergent people to stop defining and describing problems from their own point of view? So I think this links to the double empathy problem as well. What would you recommend? Listening and empathy clearly help, but the main framework of interpretation would still remain the same. For instance, dyslexia is a learning or a reading disability. So how do we change these perspectives? How do we challenge this idea of,
Yeah. If I'm sorry, my processing on this is a little bit slow. So
okay.
Sorry if I misunderstood this question, but something I've been thinking about a lot is this, like, how do you actually make people care? Because I care about my research, a lot of dyslexic and neurodivergent people care about my research, but how do you get people outside of that, like the echo chamber, I guess, to care? And I think a key to that is storytelling, just making sure that not like, as well as storytelling, listening to individual experiences, trying to get those experiences more widespread. I have a few ideas of how that can be done. Like some of the quotes that my participants have shared, just thinking about ways that those can be put into like the general public to get people to care. And then once you get people to care about a group of people, then change happens. I think this might be a completely inaccurate statistic because numbers are not my strong point, but it's something like if you get 13% of people to care about an issue, that's when change starts to happen. And yeah, I think that's where like stakeholder groups as well can be really helpful for that. Like Henna and I, in both of our research, we've worked with groups of people, and again, that just like getting those stories out there makes a difference. I think that, yeah, I hope that answers the question. I don't know if I've just stolen a bit of Henna's answer.
No, that's okay. Well, I could sort of answer it from a research perspective as well, in terms of one of the things, particularly in autism research, that's come out of the double empathy problem and the move to understand this idea that, different experiences of the world create completely different research questions about autism. And instead of sort of saying, oh, do autistic people have a deficit in theory of mind? The question becomes, how do autistic people theorize about other people's minds? Because it's different doesn't mean it isn't there. And the way that comes about is, as Zoe's just sort of hinted at, that the research is starting to come from, the research questions are starting to come from the stakeholder groups. So, anxiety became a focus of my doctoral research because the autistic community said this is a priority for us, rather than because, it was a priority for anybody else. And that's the beauty of qualitative research as well. So doing research that starts with people's stories and not necessarily with statistical surveys or tests that are carried out in a laboratory. Is the triangle chasing the shape, and does that mean the triangle is angry at the shape? Which are just sort of these nonsense experiments in human thinking that have been dreamt up by non-autistic researchers. And of course, I mean, quite a lot of non-autistic people too, but certainly a lot of autistic people are looking at it and going, it's a triangle and a square. Nobody's chasing anyone. This is it's a computer animation. They're not ascribing human emotions to these shapes. But those kind of changes in the research culture around autism have come from the fact that autistic people are given the roles to direct and lead the research, to shape it. And where you get a situation like mine was, where I am a non-autistic researcher working with this marginalised community of autistic Christians, that it was very important to me that there was a stakeholder group of autistic Christians who had a key steering role in the research, and that I did everything I could, at least, to honour that, whilst also having to work within the constraints of the university system and things like that.
Yeah, I really agree with both of your answers. And for me, I think this is like looking further at stakeholders would include charities and the work that they're doing. OCD UK do a lot of work challenging misconceptions of OCD, and it's getting to that time of year where Christmas decorations start appearing that say obsessive Christmas disorder and such like, which drives me absolutely up the wall. But it's those kind of sort of, I'm not sure what the word would be, but like under the radar misconceptions of mental health conditions that they can be really insidious and like cause a lot of damage without like you kind of realizing that that's what they're doing, because it changes what people think about OCD and how they understand that. But charities like OCD UK are doing like so much work trying to make sure that accurate portrayals of OCD are out there. There's been a couple of things recently through the charity about helping people who are putting together like plays and influencing like TV programs and things, making sure that they're hearing from people who are actually living with OCD what that might actually look like and how they could portray that more accurately. And I think that's really cool. It's really encouraging.
Brilliant, thank you. And actually, Paula, I've got a question here for you. So may Paula share more about her experience in mindfulness with people who have OCD? What about her experience, or what about your experience integrating mindfulness with the Christian spiritual heritage, such as retreats and Lectio Divina?
That's a really good question. For me, my faith is something that I find quite difficult to engage with because of my OCD. I used to find, particularly when I was a teenager, finding the Bible, reading that quite scary. Some of the like imagery they use is quite like gruesome and quite like frightening. So I found that difficult to sort of sit with in any kind of mindful context. But I think trying new things has been quite fun. Like there's a lot of YouTube videos out there that sort of do this sort of guided meditation thing, and I'm not very good at it, and I'm not very good at sitting still and just listening to something, but I've been trying to reframe things so that I'm learning to sit with discomfort. So it's probably not the best answer, but like learning how to be uncomfortable and learning how to be at odds with what's going on in my head and kind of be able to slowly learn how to tolerate that more and more, and then it kind of loses its power over me. So I think being able to work on that in a sort of faith context as well, kind of like building that slowly into my routine where I think it would be helpful. I think there's a lot of power in kind of learning to be uncomfortable. And yes, it's not always the most encouraging of answers, but I think it's really important. Like, yeah, a lot of treating OCD is learning how to navigate that discomfort and make it mean less in the long run. And I think mindfulness is, when framed for people with OCD, can be really helpful for that. And I can see potential for like integrating faith practices into that as well. But
I could speak a little bit into this question of integrating mindfulness with, having a Christian faith. Obviously, I do a lot of pastoral work outside of the research world. And within mindfulness, particularly if you're doing mindfulness within something called acceptance and compassion therapy, so this sort of idea of coming to a more secure sense of self and intentionality in the world, a part of the mindfulness practice there is, you notice the thoughts that come to you when you're trying to just think about your breathing or your body or something, and you say, oh, thank you, mind, for that thought. That even if it's a negative thought, is my mind trying to protect me from something, because I've got this tricky brain that's trying ever so hard to stop me from being socially ostracized or bullied or in danger, or, and say, oh, thank you, mind, for this thought that's trying to protect me. But I don't need this thought just now. So we're going to shuffle it off out of the way and go back to thinking about breathing. And what I found myself doing when I'm sort of working with that acceptance and compassion therapy type mindfulness is then my second layer of thought over the top of that is, oh, and thank you, God, that you gave me this tricky mind, and that you've also given me these tools to help me live with it and use this to give me quite a full life, and not a life where I have to hide away and, not kind of do well in the world and feel like I'm not living the life I want for myself. So you sort of build that moment where you notice your thoughts and you're in the third person perspective place. That's where you can engage with God if you're a Christian or a person of any faith, really, even a person of, quite an open sense of spirituality, and just kind of cultivate a feeling of thankfulness for the complexity of the mind and for the way it tries ever so hard to protect us, whilst also then inadvertently being a slightly over-helpful friend.
Just to add to that, a resource that I've been engaging with at the moment is Karen O'Donnell's book. It's a new book called Survival. It's not about neurodiversity, it's about trauma, which obviously that is a different conversation altogether. But when I'm reading it, I think a lot of what she has to say about trauma practices could be used in the neurodiversity conversation. She takes practices like Lectio Divina, Rosary, yeah, how do you say that? The Rosary, different forms of prayer, practices of eating and feasting, things like that, and she uses those practices and reframes them for trauma survivors. But I think a lot of what she says could be relevant to the neurodiversity conversation. So yeah, that's Survival by Karen O'Donnell, if anyone's interested.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. So, Henna, this one is addressed to you. Have you found through your research any suggestions to help parents or carers and teachers of non-verbal autistic children to recognise their child's anxiety and help them relieve and express this?
Yeah, okay, it's a great question. I don't want to speak outside my area of expertise on this. My particular research into autism and anxiety was not with those who had, the level of intellectual disability that I think is being referred to in the question there. I think probably the best thing to do would be to look for advice from those who can really speak about this, from a more informed perspective, which would the National Autistic Society website would be a good starting point. We have done some work at the centre with non-speaking autistic people. That work is continuing at the moment. And again, that's Leon van Ommen's area of work, but it's not specifically looking at anxiety. So I think in that regard, probably best to go to the professional sources of advice at this point.
Amazing. And we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to throw one question, and maybe we'll see how we go in terms of how many people answer it. And I think it's quite an interesting one. It's, can you share your experience with having so many thoughts running through your mind all at once and being able to hear God in the midst of all that? How can I tell when God is talking to me and when I'm just having more and more of my own thoughts? So quite a big question to end on, but we'll see what we can get to in the next few minutes.
It's a really good question, though, and I think it kind of resonates with what I was saying about OCD, and it feels like there are just too many thoughts in my head, and all of them are important. And it's something that I've been researching in part of my PhD, is it can be really hard to tell those thoughts apart, and especially if you're trying to treat OCD and feeling like those thoughts have maybe come from God, it can be really difficult to go through therapy and be like, well, I don't want to stop doing this behavior because I think it came from God. And for me, I don't know if I've had an experience where I feel like I've heard from God, but I feel like God wouldn't want me to be suffering. So if I've had a thought and I feel like I need to engage in a compulsion because of that, I don't think that's what would be wanted for me. So kind of separating out what I think about God and what I think about OCD has been really helpful, like trying to reframe, like, my faith shouldn't be upsetting me and it shouldn't be hurting me. So if it's doing that, it's probably OCD.
That's a really good way of looking at it. Brilliant. All righty. Well, with that, I think we will call a halt to the Q&A part of this session. But thank you ever so much to the panel for your fantastic answers and your extensive responses. But also thank you to everybody who has been watching today and asked such insightful questions. It's really helped make the session for us. So with that, it remains for me to say thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everybody who has joined us today. both live and if you're watching this back on YouTube at a later date. If you did enjoy the webinar, please do take a look at the Centre for Autism and Theology website to find out about any up and coming events. There are events that happen all the year round pretty much. It's certainly a very busy and active group. So please make sure that you check out the website to find out more about other events that might be coming up in the not too distant future. And there's also the option to join the mailing list, so you can keep in touch with the centre that way. And the website is nice and easy. It's CAT at Aberdeen, which is spelled ABDN.ac.uk. So not the full word, it's ABDN. So CAT at ABDN.ac.uk. And with that, thank you ever so much. And on behalf of everyone in the centre, we wish you a really peaceful evening. Bye-bye.